Welcome to BachTalk, Thinking Through Music. I'm Carlton Monroe, your host. Today's episode is a preview episode of our upcoming Vespers service on Sunday, October 26th, 2025. My guests are regular guest Adam Shoaff, who gives us an overview of the featured cantata, BWV 90. And then I speak with our guest conductor for this Vespers, Christopher Holman. I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast our resident scholar, Adam Shoaff. Adam, how you doing?
Hi, Carlton. Doing great. It's nice to be back. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this cantata. We're going to be talking about Cantata 90, which is the featured cantata on our October 26th Bach Vespers. And a little bit later in the podcast, I'm going to have a chance to interview our guest conductor for this Vespers, Christopher Holman. So I get to just sit back and listen and experience the cantata like everyone else in the congregation. So I'm very much looking forward to that and can't wait to hear what you have to say about this piece.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you get to sit back and relax just like us and just listen and enjoy.
It'll be nice. Well,
Yes, I'm sure.
take it away.
All right. All right. BWV 90. The Bach scholar Marcus Ratai has written about end times theology in the 18th century and how this theology is reflected in the music of Bach and Georg Philipp Telemann. Composers in the early 18th century depicted the return of Christ in a couple of different ways. One way imagines a mystical wedding scene between Christ and his bride, the faithful soul. We can see this interpretation reflected in Bach's cantata Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, BWV 140, where Christ is described as a coming bridegroom, and listeners are encouraged to make yourselves ready for the wedding. The other way that composers depicted the return of Christ involves scenes of tribulation and battle. This more harrowing vision was shaped by the lasting impression of war, plague, and natural disaster on the European imagination. It is this vision of the end times that we encounter in this week's cantata, Es reißet euch ein schrecklich Ende, which translates to a terrible ending rips you away. This work is one of Bach's most intense cantatas, both for its subject and its musical imagery. To me, it recalls the later Dies Irae movements of Mozart and Verdi. And while the Lutheran Bach never had the opportunity to write a Requiem Mass or a Dies Irae movement, his portrayal of Judgment Day in this cantata paints a similarly terrifying picture. Bach composed Es reißet euch during his first year in Leipzig. The premiere occurred at the St. Thomas Church on November 14th, 1723, which was the 25th Sunday after Trinity in the Lutheran calendar. As with many of Bach's cantatas, the author of the text that Bach set to music is unknown. This cantata is on the short side. There's no big choral fantasia at the beginning. Rather, it consists of only 5 movements, 2 solo arias, 2 solo recitatives, and a concluding chorale. It can all be performed in under 15 minutes. It's thought that perhaps Bach saved time on this cantata because he was already at work on his first large-scale composition in Leipzig, the Magnificat, which he premiered a few weeks later on Christmas Day. I also want to point out that this cantata belongs to a smaller subset within the first yearly cycle. After the premiere of Es reißet euch on November 14th, Bach followed the next week with Wachet, betet, betet, wachet, or Watch, Pray, Pray, Watch, another cantata with apocalyptic themes. These 2 late Trinity season cantatas, calling on the listener to prepare for the imminent coming of Christ, lead then into the first Sunday in Advent, marking the beginning of the Christmas season. The cantata for that Sunday, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, or Now Come, Savior of the Heathens, announces the arrival of the Savior, thus providing the climactic moment or the end goal of this trio of thematically related cantatas. As I often say, when looking at Bach's sacred cantatas, it's important to start with the scripture readings for that particular Sunday. These readings were the source of Bach's inspiration, and they often help explain some of his compositional choices. The epistle reading for the 25th Sunday after Trinity comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 to 18. This passage deals with Christ's second coming. The key passage for Bach may have been verses 16 to 17, which read, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air." The gospel reading for this Sunday comes from Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 28, where Jesus predicts the troubles that will precede the coming of the Son of Man. As we'll soon see, I think what may have stood out for Bach is the sudden panic of this passage. Jesus says, "When ye shall see the abominations stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take any belongings out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return to take his cloak. Pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." So let's preview some of the music. The first movement, an aria for tenor, begins with an accusatory warning for the unrepentant. "A terrible ending rips you away, you sinful despisers. The extent of sin is at full measure, yet your utterly stubborn mind has entirely forgotten its judge." The music Bach provides to accompany this text is pure fire and brimstone. The first violin sets the scene with a furious melody in perpetual motion. This violin part is occasionally punctuated by upward rushing scales, and I've put a red box around one of these ascending scales on the screen. I believe that these ripping scales are a reference to the title of the cantata. Es reißet euch comes from the German verb reißen, meaning to rip or to tear or to rend. It's an example of German onomatopoeia, where the sound of the word matches its meaning. Es reißet euch hin means that it rips you away. And Bach depicts this very vividly through these upward rushing scales. It's a great example of poetry and music working together to create drama. After the opening ritornello, the tenor enters. It's possible that Bach chose the high male voice for this aria because he wanted to depict a frightened person caught in the moment of panicked terror, and the high voice does this more convincingly. The tenor begins with a melisma on Es reißet that quickly takes him to the top of his range. And then Bach does something unusual. On the words ein schrecklich Ende, a terrible ending, the tenor interrupts the word schrecklich with res. It goes ein schrecklich Ende. It's a realistic way of showing the narrator choked with fear. And notice that after the tenor finishes that phrase, then there's that rushing upward scale in the violin, ripping us away again. So let's listen now to the opening of this aria so that you can hear this tribulation scene with the fiery, ripping violin and then the halting, fearful tenor. Later in the same movement, Bach goes even further with his musical depiction. The tenor continues to sing, Es reißet euch ein schrecklich Ende. The violin has its ripping scales, and then without warning, this driving, propulsive aria comes to an immediate halt. The scene is interrupted, frozen on an inverted dominant seventh chord, a harmony that sounds dissonant and unresolved. After a short pause, the music then resumes. Bach's message with this sudden break seems to be that the terrible ending could come at any moment, like lightning from the east, as it says in Matthew's Gospel. And so the individual is implored to remember God and put aside their sinful ways. Let's listen now to this interruption. I just have to say, as a tenor, I love this aria so much. It's so dramatic. The third movement aria offers another warning to sinners about the coming judgment. The text reads, "Thus the vengeful judge zealously extinguishes the lamp of the word, indeed as punishment. You must, O sinners, due to your transgressions, suffer this horror on holy ground. You make the temple into a murderous house." The appearance of the avenging judge, or in German, the rächende Richter, surely inspired Bach to grant this aria to the bass, the voice part always associated with God and judgment in the 18th century. Here, the deep-voiced judge exhibits his power by striding across arpeggios in the same manner as an operatic hero. Accompanying the judge is a virtuosic trumpet part, played at the premiere by Bach's chief trumpeter Gottfried Reiche. The trumpet, of course, is a common apocalyptic symbol. Remember that the epistle reading from 1 Thessalonians predicted that the Lord shall descend from heaven with a shout and with the trumpet of God. This bass aria thus provides a musical interpretation of Paul's vision that is meant to be both awe-inspiring and frightening at the same time. Besides the trumpet with its martial fanfare figures, the strings contribute downward rushing scales that perhaps signify crashing lightning or collapsing mountains. In other places, the strings and the basso continuo rumble on repeated 16th notes, recalling thunder or maybe an earthquake. So let's listen to this appearance of the judge. While the two arias deliver a hard-hitting message about the consequences of sin, the two recitatives remind the audience that God is not simply a punisher, but also a God of grace, and he offers his protection to believers. For example, the second movement recitative begins by declaring that the goodness of the Most High is renewed day after day. The fourth movement, shown here on the screen, states with confidence, "The eye of God views us as the chosen ones. And while no one can number the multitude of foes, the champion of Israel still protects us. His arm obstructs the enemy's advance and helps us on. In danger, the power of the word becomes even more recognizable and apparent." So, even though the recitatives tend to get overlooked in discussions of this cantata due to the high drama of the arias, it's important to recognize the role that the recitatives play in this cantata by providing some contrast and balance to the more hair-raising visions of the arias. This cantata ends with a four-part chorale. While I usually don't say much about these short closing movements, I want to address this one because I think that Bach sneaks in one last vision of apocalypse. Before I talk about that, here's the full text. "Guide us with your right hand, and bless our city and land. Grant us ever your holy word. Protect us from the devil's cunning and murder. Impart a blessed hour when we will be with you eternally." The key phrase here is the penultimate one, impart a blessed hour, verleih ein seliges Stündlein. The blessed hour, the Stündlein, refers to the moment of death. When Bach arrives at the end of this Stündlein phrase, he provides a very unusual kind of evaded cadence. He's in the key of F major, and typically an evaded cadence in Bach's day would shift to D minor, a key that is closely related to F major. But Bach's evaded cadence doesn't go to D minor, instead it goes to D flat major, a distantly related key to F. In music theory class today, we call this a chromatic third shift. Such a harmonic movement, the chromatic third, has a curiously magical, mystical kind of quality to it. When you hear it, when you hear one chord go to the next, it sounds as though you're stepping into another world. That's why chromatic thirds were popular with the Romantic generation of composers. You'll find them in Mendelssohn, in Wagner, in Brahms, composers working 100 years after Bach. And so to find this kind of harmonic movement in the 1720s is rather unusual. It shows how innovative Bach was in his use of harmony, and it also shows his care for effective text setting. When Bach arrives at the word Stündlein, he uses the magical effect of this harmonic shift to make the blessed hour seem almost real. It reminds us that the word apocalypse in the original Greek referred to an unveiling or a revelation. My interpretation of this phrase is that Bach is presenting the moment of death as a moment of unveiling. So let's listen now to this entire chorale. Instead of the music, I'm going to leave the text on the screen for you to follow along. And just notice the magical effect that Bach creates and the way your ears kind of perk up when we arrive at Stündlein. It's a very ingenious way of painting the text. Carlton, when I first planned this talk, I was thinking of putting on a conclusion just to wrap things up. But as I was working and listening to that chorale, I thought, there's nothing left to say after that
There
chorale.
really isn't.
Let that be the ending.
I'm so glad you made that choice. That was just perfect. What an amazing ending to a really incredible piece. I thank you
Yeah,
so much, Adam. This was
yeah.
just so fantastic. What a fantastic dive into this piece. I
Yeah, I
find
enjoyed
this,
so much looking at it, listening to it, thinking about it, writing about it.
it's an interesting piece. One of the things that I will do in the Vespers is I will deliver a reflection, which I do every time we have these services and perform these pieces. And I think this is an interesting cantata because I think one of the things that I try to do is always find ways to make this music accessible to a modern audience, not just in a sort of artistic or aesthetic way, but in a way that provides some level of meaning for people. I think this one's a challenging one because I think the images of the end times. This is not something that a lot of people, modern American congregations, think a lot about, or
Yeah.
and I think we're much more comfortable with the images of Christ and his bride image of the apocalypse as
Kind of more
opposed to the
symbolic, yeah, rather
yeah.
than literal.
And I think some of the, I mean, it's very understanding why Bach would use this kind of imagery because the amount of war and as you said, plagues that his community, his area would have experienced in the 50 to 60 years before were unbelievable. And
Yeah.
so that kind of imagery probably spoke even more. And I think it's interesting because, in a way, we're only 5 years removed from something of a plague,
From our own
right?
plague, yes.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
maybe there's a little bit of that we can connect with and sort of understanding this kind of musical expression. So, well, Adam, thank you so much for that. Next, I'm going to be jumping into a conversation with our guest conductor, Christopher Holman. My guest today is Dr. Christopher Holman, an organist, conductor, and scholar who serves as director of music at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and the Athenaeum of Ohio and at St. Gertrude Catholic Church, both very significant Cincinnati Catholic institutions. He's a winner of the Albert Schweitzer organ competition and has performed at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. He's an Oxford-trained musician, but most importantly, he regularly sits down with me to enjoy burgers at 50 West Brewing Company. Christopher, welcome to BachTalk.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you. I'll admit to listeners and viewers, we have become good friends as we have met recently and done a lot of music making together. So I'm excited to talk to you about this October Vespers program. I'd like to start with a couple of questions to sort of table set what we are getting ready to do in a week with the Bach Vespers. So just for listeners, the next Bach Vespers will be October the 26th at 5 p.m. at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. The cantata for the day is Bach's Cantata number 90, which I chose. Christopher is going to be our guest conductor for this Vesper service, and he chose works by members of the Bach family to pair with that. So my first question is, what are the pieces you chose, and why did you choose those?
Yeah, so the first piece is Unser Leben ist ein Schatten, which is by Johann Bach, so several generations above Johann Sebastian. And then Es ist nun aus mit meinem Leben, It is now over with my life, by Johann Christian Bach. And these pieces and the cantata both deal with a very light topic, death and what happens after death. The cantata literally opens with the text, a horrible ending is heading for you, you sinful defilers. Which is just
my goodness,
kind of peak
classic lighthearted J.S. Bach, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, this is this is a pretty heavy topic. Just these pieces in general, and I think for me, it's what I'm hoping to do with these motets is to sort of paint a picture of the kind of Bach's understanding of life and specifically what happens at the end of life and then what comes after. So for a Lutheran of the 17th and 18th centuries in Saxony, the understanding was basically when a person dies, the soul it then goes to be with Christ, and it is in Christ's embrace. Luther uses that specific terminology in several of his writings. And basically, you stay in that embrace of Christ in this eternal rest until the last judgment, until the last day described in Revelation. And so for us as modern Americans, listening to this music, reading these texts along, we kind of, it's hard to wrap our minds around them in some sense because they don't look at death as a bad thing. They look at death as something that's actually positive. It's a door through which we walk to encounter the maker of all things. So that's sort of where Bach and his family are coming from. And these motets in particular talk about specifically, Es ist nun aus talks about the end of life. And it's almost as if someone is on their deathbed and they're comforting their friends and family that are around them. They say, "Don't weep for me. My tears are already dry. I'm going to someplace better." And then, Unser Leben ist ein Schatten. Our life is but a shadow on the earth. The text continues, "I know well that our life is often nothing more than mist, for here at every hour we are surrounded by death. So, though it happen not today, I will never leave my Jesus." So in a sense, death was really a very big part of life in Bach's time. People didn't live nearly as long. The mortality rate was quite high. If you got an infection... Sorry, go ahead.
No, and in general terms, life was often much more painful and full of illness.
If you got an infection, there's no penicillin to save you. You might die from that. And so death was just something that was just a more vivid part of life. And so I think for Bach and for those in his circles, they knew that they had to be prepared for this. And so these pieces are essentially talking about always being ready for whatever might come in life and in the afterlife.
It's interesting to me, but this is a little story from my childhood, because I think some of that sentiment wasn't completely absent from modern American culture, at least in my childhood. I had a little small framed knitted work of art that was a poem. It was a very famous prayer that everyone knows. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." I saw this every night of my childhood in my bathroom, and I didn't think of it as a horrible thing, right? Mm-hmm. You'd be hard pressed to find a modern American family with a poem like that in their child's room, right?
Yep.
So let's, from a personal perspective, really as a musician stepping into performing this music, how do you deal with music and art that so directly deals with mortality? Do you have to put up kind of emotional screens to this, or do you find that embracing it makes for a better performance and a more profound performance?
For me, I find that embracing it is the better way to go for it, and that's really scary because that's we're all going to die at some point, and that's a hard reality to face, but it is a reality. And in some sense, I think embracing that and really thinking about it, pondering it, examining what does that mean for me, for my family, for my loved ones, like what will that look like? It makes it that more vivid, and I think that can somehow come across even more vividly in the music, so that what I don't want is I don't want it to be some kind of abstract thing that is just, it should be something that is very real to us. And I think that by confronting that together, experiencing this music together and thinking about these things in a really serious and deep way, that's how we grow together. And we experience something in common that will last with us for the rest of our lives.
I used to when I talk to people about the blues, the musical genre, the American folk music genre, the blues, and people enjoy this, and they don't have to be sad or in dire straits to enjoy the blues, and I think it's because there's a need for human beings to practice these things. Sort of what you were saying, to think about it, to ponder it. We actually need to practice mourning. We need to practice fear in order to be able to handle these moments when they do actually happen to us. And I think that's the reason we have All Souls Day in the church, is a way to remember this on an annual basis. And in fact, that's the reason I chose Cantata 90, was because this particular service is as close in proximity to All Souls as we can get with our performance calendar. And so I feel like part of the reason that it's valuable to spend time pondering artistic works like this is because we actually need it to have healthy and grounded ways of coping with the realities of life. So let's talk a little bit about Johann Christoph Bach. So maybe just in general, I'm curious to know your impressions or thoughts about the Bach family tree, the musical family tree, and what shape does it look like, and who were the musicians before Johann Sebastian that were notable? Who were the ones after that were notable?
Yeah, so the Bach family is, again, you kind of have to think about this in terms of the typical kind of societal life of 17th and 18th century Germany, Saxony in particular. If you were from a family of cobblers, you were going to be a cobbler. Right. Your children were going to be cobblers. That was just kind of assumed. In the case of the Bach family, these are musicians. They have been musicians for really since the 1600s at least, from the earliest Bach that we have a record of. And then, of course, many of Bach's descendants were musicians as well. So Johann Christoph was an older cousin. Cousins, uncles, different what we would now maybe consider more of extended family. They tended to be more involved in the life of just the entire. They were involved in each other's lives. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Johann Sebastian Bach learned organ first from I think it was his uncle, or was it his cousin? One of the two. Yeah. At any point. Yeah, I don't remember either, but this was extremely common. You might go off to some kind of music school to study or to work with a particular musician, but usually your earliest musical training, and that usually went pretty far in your life, would usually be by members of your family. So in the case of Bach, a number of his sons went on to become musicians. CPE Bach is probably the most famous, but right. Wilhelm Friedemann as well. And then the English Bach, Johann Christian, was very active in London, composing operas and things. So yeah, it's a kind of a family tradition.
I read somewhere that J.S. Bach referred to Johann Christoph as the profound Bach. Have you ever heard that quote before?
Yeah, he talks about him in his genealogy in 1735. Yeah, he talks about him as the profound composer, and I think that comes largely from these kinds of motets, really, because that's most of the music that survives.
Right.
So Johann Christoph was the composer of Unser Leben ist ein Schatten. You can hear it in his music. I mean, he's really. Yeah. He's a composer, he's a theologian, he's a philosopher, all wrapped in one, and you hear that through his music. And the text is so expressive; it's really amazing to hear it.
So, a question about the cantata: if you were speaking to someone who is going to attend the Vespers, what are some things that you would encourage them to focus on or listen to in the performance of the piece? It's a short cantata, right? It's a
Very
one of the
short
shorter
cantata.
ones. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the big thing would be, each of these movements of the cantata have they have their own kind of what we might call affect, their own kind of idea. So the opening of the cantata, again, that text is, "A horrific ending is heading for you, you sinful defilers." That's pretty fiery. If you don't speak German, that's okay. You can get the gist of it through the music. You don't have to be able to understand every word to get something out of this. So I would say listen to the larger figures, not only from the singers, but also from the instrumentalists. Oftentimes there's interplay between them, but sometimes they go off and they do their own things. And that alone is sort of, it illuminates the text in really interesting ways.
The other thing that I think that's interesting is that the title of the cantata obviously comes from the first line of the text. But what's interesting to me is that the alternating movements present a slightly different a sense of the theology that's being discussed here. So you have these fiery texts, but then they're alternated with slightly more calm statements of the ideas, the theological ideas around death. And so I find you can't just rubber stamp this as a Schrecklich piece, right? It's got a little bit more variety.
Yeah, I mean, the immediately as soon as this aria about it coming to a dreadful end is over, the next thing that the alto sings is, "The goodness of the Most High is renewed day after day."
Exactly, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just move to a couple of questions about historical practice and performance practice. And of course, as we've discussed before, the Bach Ensemble does modern pitch, modern instruments, and what we call historically informed performance. So I guess my first question is, what's your own view on the benefits of both styles of performance? Period practice versus sort of modern interpretive practice.
Yeah, so I think that they're not they are not a kind of binary thing where you're only period or you're only modern. It's a spectrum, a very, very huge spectrum. So the kind of movement that started all of this topic of kind of trying to renew Bach's understanding of his music, or really any historical composer's music, is called historically informed performance. The historically informed aspect of that, I think, is key, because you might decide that you want your historically informed performance to include all 18th century instruments with all of the performing practices that we read about in 18th century treatises, and try to really recreate something that's historical. But for me, historically informed performance can also be something as simple as reading what a particular dance is in the Baroque period, and what several different people from that period think about those dances and how to perform them, and then looking at a piece of Bach and saying, "Oh yeah, that's that same dance. Well, maybe we should try that tempo with it and see how it looks." So it can really be a huge spectrum. I tend to find that if you really want the sound of period instruments with strings, it's not very hard to mimic it on a modern setup with kind of steel strings and all of that. It can be harder to do that with modern bows versus Baroque bows or something like that. But you can mimic it if you know what you're listening for. I think the real struggle probably comes more in wind instruments, because the timbres are fundamentally different. And I will say, I love the sound of Baroque oboes and of trumpets and all of that. And I think for me, it's the right tool for the right job with the right person playing them. But there's a reason we modernized all those instruments. They're really hard to play.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to make them sound really nice.
Yeah. So, I think for me, I would always rather hear a really good performance of a piece of Bach that is done with integrity to to the musical text. So all the notes, all the rhythms, all the text of the vocalists are super clear and super beautiful, in tune, really trying to mimic the text, trying to show what Bach has put down on paper for us. I'd rather hear a performance of that done by symphony players who maybe aren't trained in 18th century style than a performance that is supposedly in perfect 18th century style, but maybe the oboist only picked up a Baroque oboe yesterday,
right,
and doesn't necessarily know how it works.
What about interpretively? How much personal liberties do you take in interpretation versus sort of trying to stick very clearly to 18th century traditions about performing this music? Is there any areas where you, like for a modern audience, you prefer a slightly different approach?
Yeah, I always think the audience has to come first. So if they're a bunch of musicologists who know everything about 18th century performance practice, they're probably going to want to hear something that really that takes all of that into account. Yeah. In the case of a modern audience,
like specifically, one of the things we do is we present this in liturgical context, right? This is not a concert. This is a liturgy. And so I think that affects how we present the music in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Because, in the United States today, we have separation of church and state. In Bach's time, no such thing existed. The church and the state were completely intertwined. And because of that, theology and all of the kind of classical liberal arts that you would study, things like philosophy, rhetoric, Latin, all these kinds of things, they're all completely intertwined. And so I think in some sense, if we perform these cantatas in a context that has no relation to church, it's kind of a fish out of water in some sense, because the music and the theology are completely inseparable to the music. And while I think it's definitely possible to have and I'm sure many of us have experienced amazing performances that move the heart and the soul in a concert setting, there's something about it being done in a liturgy with all of the other parts of the liturgy that illuminate the cantata that somehow give us a deeper perspective into what Bach was on about.
I completely concur with that. I think one of the most interesting moments in the Vesper service is when we complete the cantata, and there's sort of a modern natural audience reaction to want to do something, right? To applaud, basically. But everyone recognizes that doesn't feel like exactly the right response, right? Yeah. Even someone who may have never attended the Vespers recognizes that in that moment, that's not actually what's required. And one of the things we usually try to do is immediately have a congregational hymn at that moment. So it gives the congregation the chance to respond in some visceral way to what they just heard. But it's just a slightly different approach than a round of applause. So
definitely.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for joining me on BachTalk. I am very much looking forward to the Vesper service, and even more than that, our next hamburger together. So
it's going to be great.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
This has been BachTalk, Thinking Through Music, the podcast of the Bach Ensemble at St. Thomas. I'm Carlton Monroe. For more information, including upcoming concerts and events, visit us at www.bachensemble.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.